Hi, this is a narrated PowerPoint of a presentation that has been made to instructional faculty to help them with the new program review in Fall 18, specifically focused on assessment. In order to keep it to 15 minutes, if you come across a slide that you want to read more carefully, I'd invite you to pause it because I shall just move through them so that this doesn't turn into a terribly long file. So I want to talk about 4 questions. What's different about assessment? What about this year? What about data? And what about tracked out? So big 4. What's different about SLO assessment? Well, the first difference really is that it is more intentional. We have been treating SLO data like we were building a new key success indicator database. And so our focus had been that everybody had to collect data on any given outcome at least once every 3 years and make sure it got looked at and somehow analyzed. And so all our mandates were about when you should collect your data and what time you should put it into the system. And the idea was at the end of 2 years, you'd run a report out of tracked out and you would look for patterns in your data. That did not prove helpful for anyone, really, or most people. So this is a more intentional process. Instead of simply collecting data and then seeing what it tells us, we're supposed to ask ourselves some question about student learning that we want to find the answer to and collect the data to answer that question. So this enables us to prioritize. Instead of collecting data on an outcome because it's its turn, we can look at the aspects of student learning we really want to do something about and do something about them. There's also more emphasis on college support in the form of workshops and on collegiality to help us use this process to look at student learning from different vantage points. It's something I've discussed in other PowerPoints, but not just like student performance towards a course goal, but how students apply that learning to other courses and to their general ed. There's also new language around program review. And again, in brief, we used to ask people to share their SLO data and tell us what, revelations they had from it. This time we are simply asking on the right, discuss the results of your program assessment. Explain anything you did or anything you found out about learning in your discipline at the course or program level. So this raises one question, which is, what do we mean by program assessment? We'll talk about that in a moment. The new language, too, around ILO assessment. We used to ask, again, a rather cryptic question about what does student performance in your discipline tell you about student learning in those skills your discipline reinforces. If you teach math, what does student math achievements tell you about students' ability to reason quantitatively? And mostly people found that question hard to answer in a constructive way. So the new language, again, asks you to discuss participation in any interdisciplinary assessment activities. In other words, this is a mandate to look at our courses in an interdisciplinary context. It also assumes in that language, participation, that this is not necessarily something disciplines are going to do, each individually starting from scratch. Interdisciplinary activities are often organized at the interdisciplinary level. And we've already had at least one flex workshop, and we will have more. So this is something that, while many faculty do organize interdisciplinary activities, we're realizing this is more about stuff you've joined in on. Finally, there's going to be, starting this fall, a new assessment documentation routine. Instead of, again, focusing on gathering data and inputting it by a certain time, we're focusing on an annual activity of assessment planning. So in fall, you write a brief assessment plan. In spring, you submit a brief check-in form. And every 2 years in program review, you basically summarize what has been memorialized in those forms. This gives us an opportunity now, looking at the new documentation routine, to think a little more about a couple of important questions. One is this business of what is a program? So you're supposed to discuss your program assessment. Now, a program is typically, as it says here, a degree or certificate. But the truth is, you don't have to assess your whole program. That is to say, you don't have to take your degree or certificate outcomes and focus on the language of those outcomes and assess them all at once. You might want to prioritize an aspect of your program that matters. You may not offer a degree or certificate in your discipline. So then you might, if you have sequenced courses, you might want to look at the end goal of those sequenced courses. And that's sort of what you want to see if it's working. The idea is it's kind of a bigger perspective than just each course taken separately. But it might also be if you don't offer a degree or certificate and you don't have sequenced courses, well, maybe there's an interdisciplinary core. There's some central concepts in your discipline you want to get across. So you might want to reinforce one of those. Or you might want to just focus on your interdisciplinary assessment, and you can say so. But it's some particular thing, a particular skill set, a particular course, a particular sequence, or a goal from a degree or certificate. And it can be an aspect. For instance, you might want to just look at whether or not students in a particular accelerated version of your courses are doing as well as the students in the regular version of your courses. So it might also be, and I realize I didn't put that in there, a student population. You can use it to serve equity goals. Anything about student learning, it's an assessment question. So then you want to say, what is the aspect of student learning you're trying to find out about? Your specific question might be, I want to know if students in, these 2 business courses, which we have bundled into one, are doing as well as the students used to do in the old version of the courses. Or maybe I want to know if a certain student population is doing as well as another, or if they have specific needs, or if students are grasping this concept, or whatever it is you want to find out. It's helpful to remind yourself of why it matters. This leads us to a second question about method, about data. What data will answer your question? Now, there's been a lot of confusion about the data we can use to do assessment. And the answer is you can use the data that answers your question. Because these questions are about student learning, typically, you will probably want to often draw that from student performance. If you want to know if students, a particular group of students have specific strengths or weaknesses, you're going to want to look at their work. But if you want to know whether students are learning overall in a different version of a course, then course grades will probably tell you that answer. As long as it is a measure of student learning, and as long as it tells you what you want to know, that you can use the method that is appropriate. And then some very rough next steps and timeline. And again, this is just a memo, because as we all know, institutional memory is difficult. And then in the spring, we have a check-in. Again, how did it go? What did you get from this process? Are you done with it? Have you answered your question, or is this ongoing? And then every 2 years, this would become the basis for your program review. So that's a summary of our changes. What about this year's program review? And here are some of the issues that may come up. The first is, because we have asked this question as if we told you 2 years ago to have a research question, you may find that you've got data on student learning outcomes, but that it doesn't really address the research question you're interested in. In that case, here's what you should do. First, if you've got data, share it, but be clear. If it doesn't answer a question you've got, say so. That's very helpful. It'll remind you what not to do next time. If you can analyze it, if it can tell you about student populations or student strengths and weaknesses, go ahead and do that. But focus on developing a sensible research question for the future, for planning, the part 4, in effect, of the program review. Don't forget, too, that in spring we all did a mapping activity. We all mapped our course outcomes to our program outcomes and our course outcomes to institutional outcomes. And a lot of you will have had curricular changes, or at least thought about curricular changes in the wake of that. And you can draw on that too. Curricular review of student learning outcomes is one way to assess your program. Another issue you might have is maybe you didn't participate in an interdisciplinary activity that you can think of over the last 2 years. Well, how do you answer that question? First of all, you may well have done. If you collaborated in a learning community, if you attended a workshop about a learning community, if you discussed any collaborations with faculty, staff, and other disciplines, focused on some shared ILO, You can talk about that. I know that a number of faculty participated in a student discussion activity in spring of 17, which didn't come off, but the faculty did participate, and we had a shared activity, and we discussed the framework of it, and we talked about institutional learning, and you could report on that. If you don't have anything you can think of, allow me to direct your attention to our website, on our workshops page at the Student Learning Outcomes website at CSM. We have 3 rubrics. If you scroll down to the workshop called Effective Communication, Critical Thinking, and Quantitative Reasoning, you will see a summary with another lovely narrated PowerPoint from a Flex Day workshop in which 15 faculty broke into groups, 3 groups of 5, and each group created an interdisciplinary rubric to assess a particular learning outcome. And the idea is those faculty are going to go back to their classrooms and use that rubric to assess students in their own disciplines and share the results with me, and we'll have a follow-up discussion. But you can do that too. Even though you weren't at that workshop, you can download that rubric and just use it to score 20 students in a relevant assignment. Tack it onto your grading, add an extra maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, and give me the results. So if that could be something you could do. It would be for this semester, so you wouldn't have the results for this year's program review, but it could be in your planning. Another issue people might find is that you are overlapping. Maybe you find yourself writing in part 3 about stuff that you then address in part 4. That's fine. It's the first iteration of this program review, and if you want to say the same thing twice, go for it. Finally, what sort of plans should you make? What research questions do you have? What student learning issue would you like to tackle? In effect, it's the same questions as the assessment plan. It's like, what kinds of things can you do, or have you done, or, would you like to do? Changes to data collection. Well, as I mentioned, you should gather the data that will answer the question you've got. And here's a sample. Who supplies this data? Well, obviously, if you're looking at student learning and coursework, it's going to be around faculty. But we could probably get a lot more information out of Banner about enrollment, course grades, about tracking student success in different disciplines. With this caveat that we are not Facebook, and we do not have 150 data analysts whose job is simply to respond to requests for information. We're working on this in the college to figure out a way to accommodate requests for data, not just from faculty, but from other people. So, for right now, you shouldn't expect to get a result in 20 minutes. But going forward, it's helpful for us to think about the kind of data that we would like to know about. And then, of course, coursework. The college administers a campus climate and satisfaction survey to students, which includes questions about learning. You can use surveys, focus groups, and whatever other measures you think of. Here's our important caution again. We're not Facebook. We're really creating a data wish list. Here's some recommended guidelines. Again, things to keep track of as you tackle an assessment question. It's good to keep track of how many students were involved, if you targeted anyone in particular, what activity it was, and so on. What about TrackDat? Those of you who are alert will notice that a lot of this documentation suggestion is basically inside-out TrackDat, except where TrackDat begins with, oh my God, this basket of SLO results is empty, and then associates analysis and next steps with each outcome. We're flipping it round. We're saying, what do you want to do? What's your analysis? What are your next steps? And then the data follows that rather than leads it. If you like TrackDat and you get good use out of it, by all means keep using it. There's no reason not to. But if you don't like TrackDat, you can just submit an assessment plan and any relevant data summaries to the Learning Outcomes Coordinator, and that should be fine. I would like you to submit an assessment plan whether or not you use TrackDat, but TrackDat is now, in effect, optional. Here are some resources. I hope this has been illuminating. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have more questions, but in the meantime, remember, I'll be on Flex Day, October 10th, if that is still in the future. We'll be doing a lot of program review workshops, but otherwise, happy reviewing.